In the spring of 1831, as the 25-year-old Joseph got settled into his new life amongst the growing number of converts in Kirtland, Ohio, the first missionaries arrived in Missouri with two intentions. The first was to scout out the area where the gathering place and city of Zion might be established, and the other was to make the first missionary efforts to the Native Americans living on the reservations just across the border in Indian Territory. Oliver Cowdery reported back on the initial missionary interactions with the native tribes.
The principal chief says he believes every word of the book, and there are many more in the nation who believe.
However, Oliver soon found out that whites were not allowed to preach to the Native Americans without a permit from the government, and were forbidden from going back. So for the time being, the missionaries focused their efforts on preaching to the local Missourians and on scouting out good areas where future Latter-day Saints could settle. Meanwhile, back in Kirtland, the church was growing. There were now hundreds of members concentrated in a fairly small area. Before the move to Ohio, Joseph gave a revelation that hinted at the law of the Lord to be revealed upon the saints' arrival in Kirtland, as well as a promise of some kind of a special endowment of power from God. The saints were not exactly sure what this meant, but not long after arriving in Kirtland, Joseph gave one of his most important revelations to date for the church. It was simply called the Law. In many respects, this revelation gave commandments familiar to all Christians. However, it also mentioned that the communal system of property that some of the people living on the Morley farm were attempting to live before their conversions was now to be transformed, and the saints were called upon to consecrate their property to the church. And behold, thou wilt consecrate of thy properties, and they shall be laid before the bishop. And after that he has received these, every man shall be made a steward over his own property, or that which he has received by consecration, as much as is sufficient for himself and family. And if there shall be properties in the hands of the church, or any individuals of it, more than is necessary for their support, it shall be kept, to administer to those who have not. Therefore the residue shall be kept in my storehouse, to administer to the poor and the needy, and for the purpose of purchasing lands for the public benefit of the church, and building houses of worship, and building up of the New Jerusalem, which is hereafter to be revealed. In the mind of Joseph and those who followed him, this was not without precedent. They looked to the earliest Christians in Acts, who had all things in common, and the people of the Book of Mormon, who did the same after the coming of the Messiah. Like the rich young man in the New Testament, they were asked to give all they had for the care of the poor and the building of the kingdom. In this voluntary system, when a person had more than what they needed, they were to give the extra to the bishop to be used to support the poor, or families whose primary breadwinner was on a mission, or for the settlement of new converts. In reality, it seems that what happened was that when people would consecrate their property, they would essentially get back what they gave, as many people did not have much extra. The exception to this being the wealthier individuals, whose extra lands would often be used to help settle new, poorer saints moving to the area. Interestingly, there is no indication when this system was implemented that Joseph took advantage of it for his own gain. While Joseph did live often on the charity of the more wealthy members, his lifestyle during these years was not above that of your average church member. Joseph seemed to have been a full believer in this system from the start, and genuinely felt it was the Lord's way of bringing about economic equality through voluntary consecration. However, as you can imagine, the system ran into trouble almost from the start, as the extra people were willing to consecrate was often less than what was needed. Also, wealthier members often struggled to make the sacrifice, as it often required them giving substantial property to the church. One prominent member named Lehman Copley reneged on his consecrated property, thus leaving dozens of newly arrived saints from Colesville, New York, without a place to settle in Kirtland. By the time summer came around in 1831, it was time for another church conference, and this one proved to be historic. In this conference, it was reported that the Melchizedek priesthood was conferred for the first time. Many Latter-day Saints are confused by this, because Joseph would have received the Melchizedek priesthood at least a year earlier if he was indeed ordained by Peter, James, and John, as he later claimed. However, it's quite possible that Joseph, who had essentially only ever been in a Protestant context, did not understand prior to this time the distinctions between the priesthood offices and the priesthood itself, let alone the notion that there were different priesthoods. Even to outsiders today, the LDS notions around priesthood and priesthood keys and priesthood offices are not exactly self-explanatory at first glance.
In this case, experience may have outrun comprehension. Because Joseph knew so little about priesthood at the beginning, Joseph could no more grasp its meaning than he comprehended the full significance of the first vision as a teenager. Although he understood such church offices as teacher and elder, it took time to comprehend that the powers of priesthood were included in the authority that went with those offices.
This new understanding of priesthood is likely to have come into focus for Smith around this time due to his continuing project of biblical revisions in Genesis. Genesis is where we encounter a priest named Melchizedek, who seems to have a priesthood that is distinct from Aaron's priesthood. In addition, Melchizedek has connections to notions of priesthood in the Book of Mormon and the New Testament. And it's easy to see how Joseph, during his study of Melchizedek, may have looked back on his earlier experience with the angels and gained a more complete picture of what it all meant. It was also connected to promises of an endowment of power, and even promises that through its power, man would be able to see God. This priesthood was to be held generally among men in the church, instead of being priests separated from the laity. Still, this was not a priesthood of all believers. Men might become priests, but it would involve a priesthood hierarchy. And that spring, Joseph organized the first presidency, which consisted of himself and 2 counselors as the highest presiding authority in the church's priesthood order. Regardless, this emerging picture of priesthood and its central role in both organizing the saints and bringing mankind back into communion with God became the central tenet of Joseph's theology and the church he established. It also sharply and forever distinguished Latter-day Saint notions about priesthood from the Protestant world. Also, the importance of these sorts of conferences can't be understated. Unlike the normal Sunday services, the conferences were where the bold vision of Joseph was conveyed and the members had their chance to respond.
The scene at the June 1831 conference typified Joseph's relationship with his people in the early years. In a log schoolhouse on a hill in a forested countryside, plain people of little education and much zeal sit before him on slab benches. He is one of them, an ordinary man amongst ordinary men. He speaks of his visions and their possibilities, trying to invest them with power and intelligence beyond his capacity to describe. They listen transfixed, puzzled, and sometimes fearful. They know a power beyond the ordinary plays around them. They want to grasp it and make it their own. Sometimes they are uncertain. Sometimes they burn with perfect certainty. They feel their lives are being elevated, their persons empowered. The concerns of farms, shops, and families drop away, and they dedicate their lives to the work.
It also should be noted that all this year of 1831, Joseph was continuing his Bible project, which was his primary concern when not administering to the church. He would read the Bible and then seek inspiration around what it all meant, and what portions of the Bible needed clarification or even expansion. And there are some reasons to believe that 1831 may have been the first time Joseph inquired about the subject of polygamy. There are reports that Joseph first learned about plural marriage practices in the early 1830s, and this was the time when he was studying the patriarchs in the Bible who had multiple wives. It's easy to see how Joseph may have had questions about this, considering that just a year prior, verses like this had been translated and then published into the Book of Mormon. Wherefore, I the Lord will not suffer that this people shall do like unto them of old. For there shall not any man among you have save it be one wife, and concubines he shall have none. So while no one knows for sure when Joseph first dealt with the polygamy question, there are good reasons to suspect that it may have been some time in 1831. Some even wonder if portions of Joseph's official revelation on plural marriage, which he dictated more than a decade later, were actually received in response to questions he was dealing with at this time in 1831. But regardless of these speculations, what we do know about this year is that after the June conference, Joseph, Sidney, and others set out for their first trip to western Missouri to check on the missionary work there, as well as to make final decisions about the location for the city and the place where the saints would settle. Unfortunately, despite high hopes, many in the company were disappointed, especially with the locals in the area. W. Phelps described the people there as
immigrants from Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and the Carolinas, with customs, manners, modes of living, and a climate entirely different from the Northerners.
Missouri was the Wild West of that era, and it was inhabited by frontiersmen, trappers, and Southerners who felt very strongly about slavery and looked upon these Northerners with a strange new religion with suspicion right from the start. And while the land seemed fair enough, many people in the party expected at least for there to be a more established church in the area after many months of missionaries being there. Suddenly, for those in Joseph's party, the full weight of what they were attempting to do came into view. But Joseph firmly declared that Jackson County was the place and dedicated the land to be the place for the gathering of the saints, where they would live the higher laws of God, including the economic system based on consecration. Then, with much ceremony, a cornerstone was then laid for the future temple, and those remaining in Jackson County were to continue to prepare the area for the gradual migration of the saints. Still, some of Joseph's party were having second thoughts as they made their way back to Kirtland, and this only got worse as tensions rose amongst the travelers as they faced dangers on the river while traveling back to Kirtland and began bickering amongst themselves. It's important to keep in mind that many in this group, including Joseph, were young men. Joseph was only 25 years old, so it's not surprising that Ezra Booth, an experienced former Methodist minister who was almost 40 at the time, was put off by seeing God's prophet act in ways he felt were below someone with that calling. Booth later said that
Joseph lacks sobriety, prudence, and stability. He showed a spirit of lightness and levity, a temper easily irritated, and a habitual proneness to jesting and joking.
Joseph was always a little self-conscious about his youth and lighthearted nature. Apart from the seriousness with which he took his calling and role in the church, we might describe Joseph in today's language as being one of the boys. Someone who enjoyed games, jokes, wrestling, laughing, and who was still very much a good-natured 25-year-old. And perhaps in the midst of the tensions on the trip, Joseph knew he had not always handled things right, as he did seek forgiveness of others in the party and the Lord. Joseph very much knew that he was a work in progress like everyone else. Joseph once said of his own imperfect nature,
"I am like a huge, rough stone rolling down from a high mountain, and the only polishing I get is when some corner gets rubbed off by coming in contact with something else."
When Joseph returned to Kirtland, he and Emma moved about 25 miles south to the Johnson farm just outside of Hiram, Ohio, where a branch was beginning to grow. Johnson allowed Joseph and Emma to live in a back room of their home with their adopted 6-month-old twins. Meanwhile, Ezra Booth, upon returning from the Missouri trip, officially renounced his membership in the church. In September, Booth had a letter printed in the Ohio Star newspaper with his feelings.
When I embraced Mormonism, I conscientiously believed it to be of God. The impressions of my mind were deep and powerful, and my feelings were exerted to a degree to which I had been a stranger. Like a ghost, it haunted me by night and by day, until I was mysteriously hurried, as if it were by a kind of necessity, into the vortex of delusion. However, on our arrival in the western part of the state of Missouri, we discovered that prophecy and visions had failed, or rather had proved false.
Joseph had been used to people criticizing him from the outside, but this was the first ex-Mormon who was so publicly determined to expose what he considered the delusion of Mormonism. Sidney Rigdon actually challenged Booth and others who agreed with him to a public debate on what he wrote in those letters. However, Booth and the others turned it down. Still, this PR problem was causing a stir in the local community. So for much of that fall in 1831, Joseph and Rigdon were working to shore up a public opinion about the church. Lorenzo Snow was 17 at the time, and later in life remembered hearing Joseph personally combat the allegations.
Joseph was standing at the door of Father Johnson's house, addressing the people. Joseph was not at that time what would be called a fluent speaker. His remarks were confined principally to his own experiences, especially the visitation of the holy angel. He simply bore his testimony to what the Lord had manifested to him. At first he seemed a little diffident and spoke in a rather low voice, but as he proceeded he became very strong and powerful and seemed to affect the whole audience with a feeling that he was honest and sincere. It certainly influenced me in this way and made impressions on me that remain until the present day. I thought to myself that a man bearing such a wonderful testimony as he did, and having such a countenance as he possessed, could hardly be a false prophet.
So while the Ezra Booth letters caused issues, it was short-lived, and Joseph was able to again establish confidence amongst his followers and continue bringing in converts to the church. However, Joseph faced another controversy in that fall of 1831 when, at a meeting with church elders, he announced that he intended to have his revelations published. Some worried about how the public would react to these revelations, especially considering that some revelations were not intended for the general public, and others spoke of big plans, like gathering the saints into a specific area, which obviously might inflame local opinions. Also, there was some concern over the exact wording of the revelations. Considering Joseph felt at liberty to give inspired edits to past revelations, it seemed clear that the revelations were not the infallible rendering of God's exact words. It seemed clear to everyone involved that, in some sense, Joseph's fallible mind was still in some way involved in the revelatory process. The revelations themselves seemed to claim as much. These commandments are of me, and were given unto my servants in their weakness, after the manner of their language, that they might come to understanding. So while Joseph's revelations were seen as binding on the church due to his role, Joseph was not seen as the sole oracle of all revelation, like some infallible guru. Everyone was encouraged to seek revelation from God for their own stewardships, and as all involved were still human beings, no one was presumed to be infallible. So publishing Joseph's potentially imperfect revelations in a world that believed in scriptural infallibility caused some concern. Regardless, Joseph was sure that his revelations were still reliable and inspired, and challenged anyone present at the meeting to produce a revelation like the ones that he had produced. William McClellan was considered the most educated in the group, and perhaps under pressure from others attempted to produce a revelation like Joseph's, but failed. This seemed to affirm Joseph's unique ability to receive revelation for all involved, and all not only consented to the publication of the revelations, but also signed as witnesses, a statement of their own testimony of the revelation's reliability. This publication of Joseph's revelations was first known as the Book of Commandments, which later was changed to be called the Doctrine and Covenants, which has become to this day the library of modern canonized revelations for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And shortly after publication began, Joseph produced a revelation that totally reconceptualized traditional notions of heaven and hell. In those first cold months of 1832, Joseph was continuing his review and inspired revisions of the Bible. And in February, Joseph and his scribe Sidney Rigdon came upon the following verse in John 5. "And they shall come forth, they that have done good, unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil, unto the resurrection of damnation." Joseph and Sidney seem to have sought the Lord's guidance as to what this meant, because Joseph and Sidney reported what happened.
And while we meditated upon these things, the Lord touched the eyes of our understandings, and they were opened, and the glory of the Lord shone round about.
What Joseph described was a heavenly vision, in which he and Sidney were shown the premortal world, the fall of Lucifer and his angels, and the ultimate destiny of mankind. However, unlike the traditional view of a binary heaven and hell, Joseph was shown that all but those who willingly deny Christ in full knowledge will inherit some sort of eternal glory. In this vision, heaven was more like a spectrum than a binary. In this revelation, which was called the Vision by early saints, Joseph and Sidney described three kingdoms of glory, called the telestial, the terrestrial, and the celestial kingdoms. The afterlife described in the vision borders on universalism, in implying that nearly all will inherit some degree of glory, but it still maintains a difference in outcome based on our relationship to Jesus Christ. And while there are others in history like Emanuel Swedenborg who had posited heaven was not merely binary, there is nothing in the historical record to imply that Joseph was studying those sources. Instead, the historical record indicates that this revelation was the product of Joseph's reflection on the Gospel of John. And while this vision may have caused some concern among early Latter-day Saints in how sharply it veered from Protestant notions of heaven and hell, it was canonized and now exists as section 76 of the Doctrine and Covenants, and to this day, it is one of the unique hallmark doctrines of the Latter-day Saints. Still, as the spring of 1832 approached, Joseph was about to go through one of the worst experiences of his life. On the evening of March 24th, Joseph was helping Emma with their little 10-month-old adopted son, who was still recovering from a fever. Joseph went to bed that night in a trundle bed, cuddled next to the sick baby. In the darkness, Emma awoke to hear a tapping on the window. Then, suddenly, the silence was shattered as a group of men broke in the front door and dragged Joseph out of his bed as Emma screamed in terror. Joseph fought back as best he could, as one of the men there remembered.
Joseph drew up his leg and gave a kick, which sent one of the men sprawling in the street. He afterwards said the prophet was the most powerful man he ever had hold of in his life.
Still, Joseph was outnumbered, and a chunk of Joseph's hair was ripped out in the struggle. As they drug him out, a large mob waited outside. As they drug him out, Joseph remembered seeing Sidney Rigdon unconscious on the ground. They beat Joseph and ripped off his clothes. While totally naked, Joseph remembered,
"One man fell on me and scratched my body with his nails like a mad cat, and then muttered out, 'That's the way the Holy Ghost falls on folks.'"
They poured hot tar on Joseph's nude body and threw feathers on him to mock him. Then, as a final act of cruelty, they stretched the nude and beaten Joseph over a board to do something unspeakable.
They had stripped him naked for the purpose of castrating him, and had Dr. Dennison there to perform the operation, but when the doctor saw the prophet stripped and stretched on the plank, his heart failed him, and he refused to operate.
In the end, the mob spared Joseph's life, thinking they had sent a clear message that Joseph was no longer welcome in the area. So the nude and beaten Joseph stumbled back to his home. The report is that Emma fainted upon seeing the tar on Joseph's body, which she mistook for blood.
My friend spent the night in scraping and removing the tar and washing and cleansing my body.
One can only imagine the state of shock Joseph was in from this terrible assault on him and his family. Still, the historian Dan Vogel reports how Joseph reacted.
In the morning, despite his battered condition, which included a possible broken rib, a missing front tooth, and a bald spot on his head, he went to Sunday meeting as usual and preached, with a slight whistle, to a congregation that included some of the mobbers.
Still, despite Joseph's resolve, the attack was not without its victims. People said that after this beating, Sidney Rigdon was never the same, and some modern historians believe he may have suffered a brain injury as well as PTSD from the experience. Also, apparently in the struggle and with all the commotion, the door to Joseph's room was left open for an extended period, with Joseph's little 10-month-old adopted son exposed to the freezing night air. The baby was apparently in the process of recovering from an illness. but this exposure caused the baby to relapse. And a few days later, after the attack, Joseph's adopted twin son was dead. So after a brief period of mourning, Joseph again had to go to Missouri. But he and Emma obviously did not feel safe in Hiram where the attack had happened. So while Joseph was gone, Emma went with the surviving 10-month-old twin Julia to live with friends in Kirtland. The purpose of Joseph's trip to Missouri was primarily to have a conference with the saints who had moved there and to settle issues and complications that arose as they tried to live the economic system based around the consecration of properties. The leader of the saints in Missouri was Bishop Partridge, who was under considerable stress trying to manage this system. The bottom line was that the saints just did not have much extra to give, so the system was perpetually trying to meet needs bigger than the funds they had available. And Missouri, more than anywhere else, was the place where Joseph intended for this new economic system to be lived fully. And aside from the later mob violence, the inability for this economic system to work fully, either due to the saints not having much extra or an unwillingness to share, seems to be at the heart of why Joseph's vision for an Enochic Zion city never came about. Still, during the trip, Joseph worked to resolve tensions and problems in that Wild West frontier, and he instructed the leaders to begin publishing the Morning and Evening Star under the direction of W. Phelps. Phelps was a gifted, though sometimes eccentric, writer and publisher who had joined the church about a year earlier. Small publications in that era were like the social media of the time. This was the way in which a group could begin to participate in the public conversation, and the early Latter-day Saint publishing efforts were critical in the initial growth and spread of the church. Still, as Joseph was on his way home, he could not help but feel burdened. He had a lot of weight on his shoulders. He had just lost a baby. His wife was living with friends after a mob had beaten and humiliated him. But perhaps the thing that finally broke Joseph's spirits was that while en route home, he found out that his brother Hiram had lost his 2-year-old daughter to an illness.
She expired in my arms. Such a day I never before experienced. And oh, may God grant that we may meet her again in the great day of redemption, to part no more.
Everything in the historical record indicates that Joseph and Emma were very close. Emma had always been the one Joseph looked to in his hardest moments, and who he shared his deepest feelings with. He wrote to her on the trip home.
My situation is a very unpleasant one. I have visited a grove which is in the back of the town almost every day, where I can be secluded and give vent to all the feelings of my heart in meditation and prayer. I will try to be contented with my lot, knowing that God is my friend, and in Him I shall find comfort. I have given my life into His hands. I am prepared to go at His call. I count not my life dear to me. I hope you will comfort Hiram and the rest of the family. I should like to see little Julia once more, and take her on my knee and converse with you on all the subjects which concern us.
It's interesting to study Joseph's private letters, as they seem to convey his sincere belief in what he was doing. In fact, an examination of the totality of Joseph's life seems to reveal that the biggest believer in Joseph's claims was Joseph himself. Despite the hardships that Joseph faced, he pressed on. As the fall of 1832 approached, he continued his biblical studies and corrections. While examining the book of Hebrews and its notions around 2 priesthoods, Joseph gave a revelation that outlined the central role of the priesthood in biblical history, as well as the central role that it plays in man's connection to God. This revelation laid the foundation at the center of Joseph's unique theology, wherein, through priesthood and its connection to later temple rituals, man could be brought into what Catholics describe as the beatific vision, or what in ancient Israel was entry into the Holy of Holies. The idea was that through priesthood power, a person could be brought into God's presence. The revelation on the priesthood also emphasized the importance of missionary work, and despite Emma being far along in her pregnancy, the revelation called Joseph and Newell Whitney to go to the big cities on the East Coast. At this time, the missionaries had largely focused on the rural communities in the United States, and Joseph himself had never been to anything like New York City. So one can only imagine Joseph's shock when he came into New York. He wrote of the experience to Emma.
This day I've been walking through the most splendid part of the city of New York. The buildings are truly great and wonderful to the astonishing of every beholder. The language of my heart is like this: can the great God of all the earth, maker of all things magnificent and splendid, be displeased with man for all these great inventions?
Joseph was clearly not against technological advancement, but he also spoke less optimistically about the effect of an urban lifestyle on people's spiritual state.
Nothing but the dress of the people makes them look fair and beautiful. There is something in every countenance that is disagreeable, with few exceptions.
Joseph and his companion spent their time in New York, Albany, and Boston looking for any venue they could to share their message and to call the people from the decadent world to follow the saints, but apparently with only limited success. In late October, Joseph and Newell hurried home as Emma was near the time of her delivering, and late in the night of their arrival, Emma gave birth to a son who, unlike Emma's first 3 children, would survive to adulthood. He would be called Joseph, just like his father and grandfather, and play a significant role in later Latter-day Saint history. Also, another major figure in Latter-day Saint history came into the picture that November when Joseph had just recently arrived back from New York. His name was Brigham Young, and he came to Kirtland to meet Joseph Smith. Brigham had initially been skeptical of Mormonism, but after almost a year and a half of studying the Book of Mormon that came into his hands through Samuel Smith, he became convinced of its truthfulness. But he was more impressed at how this new worldview was able to shake him free from a more restricted creedal worldview that seemed to force people into rigid dogmatism regardless of what was true.
Were you to ask me how it was that I embraced Mormonism, I should answer, for the simple reason that it embraces all truth in heaven and on earth, no matter who has it.
So when Brigham came to Kirtland, he was not looking to see if his new faith was true or not, but he did want to meet the man behind his new faith. And he did not meet a man in an ivory tower. He reported meeting the prophet for the first time that November as Joseph was out chopping wood for the coming winter. So as winter began to hit late in 1832, Joseph settled in with Emma, the new baby, and 2-year-old Julia. However, civil conflict, which had been brewing between the states and federal authority, came to a head, and everyone was talking about it. South Carolina was refusing to cooperate with the federal tariff mandates, and President Andrew Jackson considered the move treasonous. Joseph, no doubt, wondered how events like these played into God's plan, and Joseph rendered the following on Christmas Day, 1832. Verily, thus saith the Lord concerning the wars that will shortly come to pass, beginning at the rebellion of South Carolina. For behold, the southern states shall be divided against the northern states. And it shall come to pass that after many days slaves shall rise up against their masters, who shall be marshaled and disciplined for war. Wherefore stand ye in holy places, and be not moved, until the day of the Lord come. It should be noted that while this revelation seems to predict a specific civil war starting in a specific place that would come about long after Joseph's death, the revelation is also a much broader revelation, touching on themes of the end times. The revelation states how this war was only the beginning, and that from it, wars would spread to all nations of the earth prior to the second coming of Jesus. But the biggest development that winter was a revelation stating that the saints were to build a temple in Kirtland, Ohio. Interestingly, during Joseph's entire life, he never commissioned the building of a regular meeting house. Even later, when there were likely 10,000 members living in Nauvoo, they would meet in homes or public buildings for worship. But Joseph became obsessed with temples. These were meant to be the central hub of a Zion community. They were to be a place that could serve multiple functions. While not totally clear, it seems that a temple was initially seen by Joseph as a meeting house, a church school, a church administration building, and a place of special ceremony and ordinances, and all of these crammed into one building. From the beginning, the secular and the spiritual in Joseph's view were not separate domains. However, Joseph did not wait for the completion of the temple to begin a temple-like educational institution. He formed the School of the Prophets during the first cold months of 1833. This school was to be an educational institution in all things, both temporal and spiritual. Joseph envisioned doctrine and theology being taught alongside things like mathematics, English, and history. Joseph had revealed to him that the glory of God was intelligence, and that growing in light and truth was key to man achieving their destiny. However, this institution was also meant to be very different from just any other secular school. In some ways, the School of the Prophets was a type of proto-temple. It had distinct ceremonial elements, with students greeting one another with special ritualized greetings. And the format was not top-down, but egalitarian, with all members of the school expected to participate in the discussions with their thoughts and questions. Joseph envisioned a school of brothers who loved each other and worked together genuinely to understand all truth, both secular and spiritual. This first educational institution had less than 24 church leaders involved and met in the back room of the Whitney store. But it had a significant impact on the core leaders of the church at that time, as it was where they gathered not only to get a basic secular education, but also to discuss the deep things of the kingdom. And a landmark revelation was also received shortly after the school began. Emma and Joseph lived in the same space where the School of the Prophets was held, and apparently Emma was annoyed by the tobacco spit and the smell of smoke coming from the schoolroom. Joseph apparently sought to know the Lord's will on the use of substances like tobacco, and he received the following revelation. A word of wisdom for the benefit of the council of high priests assembled in Kirtland, and the church, and also the saints in Zion, to be sent greeting not by commandment or constraint, but by the revelation and the word of wisdom, showing forth the order and will of God in the temporal salvation of all saints in the last days. That inasmuch as man drinketh wine or strong drink among you, behold, it is not good, neither meat in the sight of your Father. Strong drinks are not for the belly, but for the washing of your bodies. And again, tobacco is not for the body, neither for the belly, and is not good for man. The revelation also stated that hot drinks were also not good for man. This was soon after clarified by Joseph and Hiram to refer to coffee and tea. However, as stated in this revelation, the prohibition mentioned in this revelation were given as a word of wisdom and not as a commandment. So many saints, including Joseph, continued to have an occasional drink. However, others felt if this was wisdom from God, then it was probably worth trusting that wisdom, and considering the revelation was explicitly given for the weakest of saints, many felt they would rather not be one of those weak saints and would rather fully comply with the revelation. In the end, it seems that the first semester of the School of the Prophets was a big success for Joseph. It gave him and the other church leaders the chance to more fully explore and clarify their unique system of beliefs. Also, Joseph at this time was almost finished with his review of the Bible and was likely looking to integrate all of his revelations and the Book of Mormon with the Bible in order to have a more full picture of God's dealings with mankind. What was emerging in early 1833 was a fascinating integration of Old Testament and New Testament themes, and the centrality of knowledge in God's plan not only to save human beings, but to exalt them.
By the time of the May 1833 revelation, a variety of meanings clustered around the idea of exaltation. The vision had introduced the term fullness into the conception of celestial life. The revelation said the saints would inherit a fullness of God's glory. All that the Father had would be theirs. The text puts no limits on the extent of this fullness. These passages altered the idea of salvation from making peace with God to becoming like God. The words salvation and exaltation contained a world of difference. One implied escape from sin or hell or Satan, and the other elevation to glory and godhood.
Glory in the mind of Joseph Smith was light and truth, which Joseph called intelligence. To this day, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints places a special emphasis on education. I myself received my degree in business from a BYU school. In fact, all of the modern church's global educational programs are run under Joseph's May 1833 revelation, which stated that, quote, "The glory of God is intelligence." That April in 1833, the school's first semester ended, likely with the intention of it continuing the next winter when farming tasks were not as pressing on its members. Joseph's attention now turned again to Missouri. That spring, Joseph continued to be frustrated that the economic order in Missouri was not really working as intended. Joseph told the saints that they were under condemnation from God for their lack of progress. Still, the leaders in Missouri rededicated themselves, and the now 26-year-old Joseph began laying out plans for the future city. Joseph's vision was to gather the saints into a city like no other, a city completely dedicated to God and one another by people who were completely consecrated to Christ and his kingdom. The city, in matters both secular and spiritual, was to be run through the priesthood leadership structures. To this day, Latter-day Saint congregations are called wards because the design of Joseph's Zion community was based on neighborhoods of saints in particular geographical locations within a city. The vision Joseph had for the gathering place was clearly idealized and bound for struggle in a world of normal human beings. And, in fact, it was his desire to gather the saints and build a city that may ultimately have led to both his downfall and his legacy. The real trouble for the saints began that summer in 1833. Joseph had just finished his Bible review along with its inspired corrections and additions that summer, and about that same time, the Book of Commandments was first published in Missouri. The fear that locals would react badly to Joseph's revelations about building a city where the Latter-day Saints would gather came true very quickly. Not only were the locals in Missouri concerned about Latter-day Saints taking over the county, but they were also deeply concerned that the people moving into their county were Northerners. That July, W. Phelps released an article in the church newspaper in Missouri that praised the abolition of slavery and talked about free blacks potentially joining with the saints in Missouri. So with Latter-day Saints now making up over 1,000 people, or about 1/3 of the county, the locals there decided that they needed to take action in order to prevent a Mormon takeover of the social and political institutions. 300 people signed a manifesto demanding the Latter-day Saints leave the county or face the consequences.
The manifesto's authors envisioned an amalgam of slaves, free blacks, and impoverished religious fanatics taking over the society. Where would it all end? Quote, "The day is not far distant when the civil government of the county will be in their hands, when the sheriff, the justices, the county judges will be Mormons or persons wishing to court their favor from motives of interest or ambition. Another religious group might be permitted this degree of control, but not Mormons. The non-Mormon settlers claimed that decisive action was necessary to protect, quote, good society, public morals, and the fair prospects of the county. The Missourians determined to, quote, rid our society of the Mormons, as they said, quote, peaceably if we can, forcibly if we must. The Missourians admitted their remedy was extra-legal, quote, believing as we do that the arm of the civil law does not afford us a guarantee, or at least a sufficient one against the evils which are now being inflicted upon us. but that their expedient actions were justified by, quote, the law of nature.
An armed mob went out and rounded up Latter-day Saint leaders. The mob ransacked the bishop's storehouse, which held the goods for the poorer Latter-day Saints, and then, just to make their point clear, they beat, tarred, and feathered the leader of the Latter-day Saints in that area, Bishop Edward Partridge, as well as a member named Charles Allen. They then made known their demands, that the Saints were to stop all immigration and leave the county within the next 6 months. Edward Partridge recalled the experience in later years.
Seeing the determination of the mob, some few of the leading elders offered their lives, provided that would satisfy them, so as to let the rest of the saints live in peace. At that time, most, if not all, of our people in Jackson thought they would be doing wrong to resist the mob by even defending themselves. Consequently, they thought that they must quietly submit to whatever yoke was put upon them, even to the laying down of their lives.
The Saints had plenty of experience with mockery and derision from outsiders, and Joseph had taught the Saints in a revelation to follow Jesus' example and not return hate with hate.
A revelation advised church members to bear persecution patiently, to, quote, renounce war and proclaim peace, and to be law-abiding citizens, waiting patiently on the Lord. Martyrs for the faith will be eternally blessed. I will try you and prove you herewith, and whoso layeth down his life in my cause, for my name's sake, shall find it again, even life eternal. Therefore, be not afraid of your enemies, for I have decreed in my heart, saith the Lord, that I will prove you in all things, whether you will abide in my covenant, even unto death, that ye may be found worthy. Nevertheless, the revelation explained that self-defense was permissible, but that the Lord promised increased blessings each time the saints resisted striking back.
So, feeling that none of this was legally binding anyway, the church leaders in Missouri agreed to the mob's demands because they felt it would buy them some time to pursue legal protection from the government and avoid violence.
We hoped that Providence would kindly open the way for us to still live there in peace, thinking that the government would protect us in our constitutional rights.
So, with the mob appeased for the moment, the church leaders and Joseph spent the coming months trying to get legal protection from the locals in Jackson County. And to make matters worse, Joseph personally was under threat of violence back in Kirtland. A man named Philastus Hurlbut had been excommunicated from the church for sexual misconduct previously, and decided to go back to Joseph's hometown as he heard that Joseph had enemies there. Hurlbut went to the people who had lost in court against Joseph and others who were bitter against him and got them to give written statements attacking Joseph's character. These became known as the infamous Hurlbut affidavits, which circulated widely and were a major part of the earliest anti-Mormon publications. But it was the fact that Hurlbut had said that he would wash his hands in Joseph's blood and other threats of violence that worried Smith that fall. After the horrific attack on him and his family the previous year, Joseph was taking threats more seriously. So after returning from a brief and successful mission across Lake Erie into Canada, where Joseph actually baptized some of my own ancestors in the Nickerson family, Joseph was able to come back and take Hurlbut to court and get a judgment against him for the threats. Luckily, this finally convinced Hurlbut to move on with his life and leave Joseph alone. But while Joseph was feeling safe again, the saints in Missouri were still uncertain of their future. A petition for help was sent that fall to Governor Dunklin of Missouri, but the governor said it was a local matter to be handled by the local authorities. Joseph was furious, as it was the local authorities who were siding with or fearful of the mobs. Despite the Republican and Democratic overtones in the Book of Mormon, Joseph had not been political previous to this point. But now he was realizing the immense effect that government inaction would have on his people when it refused to secure their constitutional rights. Also, many were wondering why God would allow this to happen, and if members had brought this upon themselves.
Cowdery also blamed church members who, quote, were void of understanding and were continually telling that which is not true and putting false coloring to the things of God. Cowdery was referring to Mormons who antagonized other inhabitants of Jackson County by boasting about plans to establish Zion and drive them out of the county.
Unfortunately, in late October, the mobs in Missouri found out that the Saints did not intend to leave and were petitioning the governor and other authorities to help. The mob decided it was time to move. A group of about 150 began going from settlement to settlement. They destroyed property, looted, burned, and beat anyone who resisted. And worst of all, it seems that several Latter-day Saint women were sexually assaulted. Finally, David Whitmer, one of the 3 witnesses of the Book of Mormon, was able to rally a group of about 30 men to defend the Saints. They ended up in a firefight with a larger group of 50 Missourians. During the firefight, 2 Missourians and 1 Latter-day Saint were killed.
In their later petition to Congress, Smith, Rigdon, and Higbee wrote, "When the news of this battle was spread abroad, the public mind became much inflamed against our people. The militia collected in arms from all quarters and in great numbers, and being excited to fury by false accounts which had been circulated against us." The false rumors were apparently that the Mormons were the aggressors, and that the Mormons had killed up to 20 in the battle. The fog of war had descended on Jackson County. Non-Mormons became fearful that Smith's followers had launched a full-scale revolt.
And so things went from bad to worse.
Small companies spread throughout the county, terrorizing various Mormon settlements, destroying property and driving Mormons out of their homes by force and pursuing them through the wilderness, despite the cold and harsh weather conditions. Many wandered several days without food, either individually or in hastily formed groups. According to Smith, Rigdon, and Higbee, the houses of the Mormons in the county of Jackson, which they had abandoned, numbering about 200, were burned down or otherwise demolished by the mob. Around 1,200 were displaced, fleeing into all neighboring counties, with the majority moving north into Clay County.
This was a full-scale disaster, and Joseph was distraught.
I am sensible I ought not to murmur, and do not murmur only in this, that those who are innocent are compelled to suffer for the iniquities of the guilty, and I cannot account for this. We cannot refrain from tears. When the government fails you, and the humanity of people fails you, and all things fail you, but God alone.
He agonized at the bad news from Zion. Joseph struggled to know what to do. No law officer or court would come to their defense. In a destructive irony, the people of Jackson County, in the name of democracy, deprived the Mormon people of their democratic right to live, work, and vote in the county. The only recourse in 1833 was to flee. But what about the next time? Was flight their only option? Forming a private militia had no part in the revelations, but self-defense required one. How else could they react to depredations? The seeds of Mormon militarism were sown in this moment. The Mormons were later accused of threatening the peace with violence born of religious fanaticism, but their resort to militias was the result of being treated violently themselves. Violence originated in the democracy, not in religion.
Apparently, after the violent expulsion of over 1,000 saints, the governor said he was willing to back the saints if they wanted to return to their homes in Jackson County. William Phelps reported the following to Joseph.
Governor Dunklin is willing to restore us, but as the Constitution gives him no power to guard us, we are not willing to go. The mob swear, if we come, we shall die.
Joseph was glad to hear the governor was sympathetic, but apparently the governor was only willing to help try the perpetrators of the crimes.
Governor Dunklin had promised to escort the saints back under armed guard when he brought the state's witnesses to the trial of the Jackson County perpetrators. The Mormons became vulnerable only at the trial's conclusion. Dunklin said he lacked authority to maintain a permanent militia attachment to prevent further depredations. To protect themselves, the Mormons were encouraged to organize a militia and to acquire public arms, a possible invitation to war, but the only course Dunklin could suggest.
So with this, Joseph consulted the Lord as he did with all weighty matters, and received confirmation in the form of a revelation that he was to call together 100 to 500 able-bodied men to go with him to restore the saints and protect them from their enemies. Joseph who was just a few years ago a nobody farm laborer, was now about to raise an army. That spring, Joseph and the other church leaders recruited and planned, and by the end of April had almost 200 men ready and willing to make the 1,000-mile overland journey to Missouri, which would take them almost 2 months one way. The group was eventually called Zion's Camp and was organized into smaller groups of 12, each with its own captain. The militia formed by Joseph was a mix of military-style organization mixed with religious themes and titles. Not even war was exempt from Joseph's religious worldview, and he expected his men to still be saints in the midst of the conflict, with regular prayer and religious observance. The march was long. Joseph's younger cousin, George Albert, was 17 at the time and remembered the great adventure.
George A. made note of food and sore feet. Forced on one hot day to drink slough water, he learned to, quote, strain wigglers with his teeth. He was grateful to Joseph for lending him a pair of his own boots to ease his painful feet. He watched the prophet bear up under hardships along with everyone else. When Joseph was given sweet bread rather than sour like the others, he asked for the sour. He walked all day rather than riding because the wagons were overloaded with supplies.
Joseph had a full portion of blistered, bloody, and sore feet, which was the natural result of walking from 25 to 40 miles a day in a hot season of the year.
This march became an iconic memory for all involved, and essentially all involved wrote about the experience in later years. They also even had annual reunions starting on the 30th anniversary of the march in 1864. This was a gathering of the most dedicated Latter-day Saint men who were willing to die for what they believed, and they were on an epic adventure, spending day after day with Joseph. All of them spoke of a special spirit and spiritual manifestations. Joseph even gave his beliefs about the connections between the lands they were crossing and the peoples of the Book of Mormon. However, this also was a group of mostly 20 and 30-year-old men, so conflict did arise as well, including Joseph losing his own temper a time or two. Still, Joseph wrote back to Emma that if it weren't for them missing their families,
our journey would have been as a dream, and this would be the happiest period of all our lives.
As Zion's Camp approached Missouri, the governor worried how the locals were going to react. Joseph had expected the governor to provide a state escort into Jackson County, but now the governor said he was not going to provide that escort, as he was worried that it might escalate the tensions. But the tensions were already at a fever pitch. The Missourians began burning down all the vacant Mormon homes remaining in Jackson County, and the locals began to muster a force to fight.
The approach of the Mormon company put Jackson County into a state of panic. Corral wrote on June 14th that some men were warning the inhabitants that, quote, the Mormons are coming upon them, mob-like, to kill their women and children. He reported that these men, quote, raised an alarm a few days ago in which the whole of Jackson County was in an uproar, men riding in different directions. 200 or 300 gathered together to oppose the Mormons.
However, before open conflict broke out, the leaders of the local mob tried to negotiate with the LDS refugees who had been pushed into neighboring Clay County to see if they could buy out the Saints before Joseph and his group arrived. But the Saints were unwilling to give up their lands in Jackson County. So as Zion's Camp got closer, a significantly larger force of Missouri locals went out to meet them. But just when it seemed that a full-scale battle was imminent, storm clouds appeared on the horizon. And before the clash could happen, a huge storm of wind and rain and lightning and hail swept through the area. And Zion's Camp took shelter in local buildings, including a Baptist church.
As the prophet Joseph came in shaking the water from his hat and clothing, he said, "Boys, there is some meaning to this. God is in this storm." We sung praises to God and lay all night on benches, under cover, while our enemies were in the falling storm.
The next day, they again advanced, and this time they were met by a group of locals who came in peace to find out their intentions. Heber Kimball recounted what happened.
Brother Joseph arose and began to speak, and the power of God rested upon him. He gave a relation of the sufferings of our people in Jackson County and also of all our persecutions and what we had suffered by our enemies for our religion, and that we had come 1,000 miles to assist our brethren, to bring them clothing and to reinstate them upon their own lands, and that we had no intentions to molest or injure any people, but only to administer to the wants of our afflicted brethren.
Joseph also explained that the reason they were armed was because they feared being attacked by the mobs that had attacked their people previously, and they kept them for their own defense. So apparently, Joseph's words had the desired effect, because the mob did not attack, and both parties decided to try and negotiate. However, they could not ultimately agree on a solution. It was a stalemate. The Missourians refused to leave, and the governor refused to help, and Joseph was left with the only option available being to use violent force to take back their lands. Joseph went and prayed for direction and received the following revelation. Zion cannot be built up unless it is by the principles of the law of the celestial kingdom. Otherwise, I cannot receive it unto myself. Therefore, in consequence of the transgressions of my people, it is expedient in me that mine elders should wait for a little season for the redemption of Zion. And this cannot be brought to pass until mine elders are endowed with power from on high. The revelation implied that the saints were not ready to live the higher laws of a Zion society, and violence was not going to be the solution. Instead, Joseph was to disband the camp, continue to seek legal options for redress, and focus on helping the saints grow in holiness and knowledge and receive the promised endowment of power associated with the temple and priesthood. Obviously, feelings were mixed, and some were bothered as they wanted to use violence to take back what had been taken. And things got worse when cholera broke out in the camp just prior to heading back, and many of the men died of the illness. Joseph himself got very sick as he tried to minister to others. Joseph also told the refugee saints living in Clay County to stay there for the time being, and he appointed new leadership there under David Whitmer. And with that, Joseph and the others began their long journey back from the great adventure of Zion's camp. And while some felt Zion's camp was a failure, the men from that 2-month march ended up forming the core leadership of the church for the next 50 years. It was a unique experience that brought together the most dedicated men in the church into a common cause and solidified lifelong bonds between all of the men involved. However, with the Jackson County project now on hold as they continued to seek legal remedies, Joseph and all the saints focused their efforts on the temple in Kirtland and the endowment of power promised in the Revelation, which they believed would more fully help them become a people capable of establishing Zion not only in Missouri, but throughout the world.